And so there we are. We left off. I did it last week. I only got to 1 point. And so you want to talk about an easy week when you don't have a sermon to prepare because you did it all the week before. That's a pretty easy week, right? And so just a quick reminder of where we've come so far in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's the words of a teacher, right? Ecclesia, the church, and somebody, Ecclesiastes is the term for somebody who stands in front of an assembly and gives testimony. And his testimony is pretty clear. Meaningless, everything is meaningless. Life is just a breath. And remember last week, I told you 154,000 breaths. That's how many we get each week. So since we've started this book, you guys, quick math, right? How many breaths have you taken? And we've been in it for 3 weeks. I shouldn't have asked this question, something that's going to require me to use math up here. So if somebody else could do that math. Now, that means, but from last week to this week, there's 154,000 more breaths. And the question being asked is, what profit is there to life if that's all it is but a breath? Did you do anything this week that has any transcending value? Anything this week that has value that is above the sun? Or did you spend 154,000 breaths watching TV and looking at your phone and those kind of things? The point is that we only have so many breaths in our life, right? It's all fleeting. It's coming. We breathe in, we breathe out. Each breath is like that tick of a clock that's counting down our life. And the teacher is asking, what profit is there if life is only what can be seen and observed in the physical under the sun? What profit is there? And he's gone a couple different ways. He's pointed out that if we try to figure out this problem, which is a problem that all men have, right? He says it's the burden to mankind. What an evil burden God has placed on mankind is what the writer of Ecclesiastes says. And it's because God has placed inside of our heart a desire to know something beyond just the physical, a desire to know and be in tune with a creator God. And of course, we know that we were meant to be in tune with the creator God because we were created in his image. And so mankind is the only of the species that looks beyond the physical to hope for something more and greater. And the teacher himself says this is an evil burden. I believe it's a divine mandate placed inside of all of humanity to know, like, what are we created for? What's the meaning and purpose of life? And the writer of Ecclesiastes, the teacher, says this is like chasing the wind, right? And there's a parallel in that. We've got this idea that life is habel, the Hebrew word for breath, also translated meaningless. Life is a breath chasing after the ruach, which is another Hebrew word for breath. And this is the Hebrew word that is used when we're in Genesis chapter 2, and God breathes life into mankind, and they begin to live, because this word translated in breath describes an animating feature to it. That's why it's also translated as wind, because when God breathed into man, they became animated. They began to be a living being, right? And so we are but a breath chasing after a breath. Right? And that describes the plight of mankind, I guess. What are we doing in life? We are breathing, right? In and out and in and out, and chasing after God's breath, chasing after something that's transcendent and more meaningful. And he says it's a crooked question, right? Because there's a problem with it. He can't figure it out. He can't grasp the wind. And he begins to look for meaning in all kinds of different things. Remember last week? He looked for meaning in a bottle of wine. Right? Maybe if I could just drink, then I'm going to find some transcending meaning in this. And then his buzz wore off. And then he thought, well, that was worthless because now I just have to drink again. And it becomes this cycle of meaningless. I have to drink so that I can feel good, and then I have to stop. So now I have to drink again, and I have to drink again. And it's not a question about the morality of drinking. It's not a question about that. What it is that a question about, is there any transcending value to these pleasures that we seek after? He goes on to seek after other pleasures in chapter 2. You can read all about him between verses 1 through 11, where he tries to recreate Eden, right? He's going to build a garden and make different streams or aqueducts or whatever your translation says that feeds the garden. And he's going to build for himself, and then he's going to populate the garden with servants and and playthings. The idea is like he wants to believe that there might be value in life, something that transcends if he can just pursue pleasure, right? Just pursue the happy things, right? Life is what you make it, right? Even though it seems narcissistic, which it really is, right? Life is what you make it. Come on. The idea is maybe he can find meaning in pleasure, and he comes to the end and says, nope, even pleasure is fleeting. Because eventually it's going to go. Eventually it's gone, and the only thing that's left is maybe the garden that you planted or the building that you built, but even time is going to get rid of those things as well, right? Life is but a breath, chasing after a breath, it's meaningless. And so in verse 12, we have a new idea. So he says this in verse 12. He says, then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. So he's turning his thoughts, meaning he's going to try something new. He's tried pleasure. Did it work? Was there meaning in pleasure? In the moment, maybe. But a transcending meaning? No. And so he says, I'm going to turn my mind, and the word for mind is actually heart. I'm going to turn myself to finding meaning in maybe wisdom. But he's got to explore every aspect of this, not just wisdom, right? He's also going to explore madness and folly. That's what he's going to explore. And the hope is if that he's objective and he looks at all of these things, maybe he's going to find transcending meaning in those. We might think of this as like a scale, right? You guys know the scales I'm talking about. You put some weight on this side and it goes down. You put some weight on this side and it goes down. And you want to even it out. So he puts wisdom on this side. And by the way, this is worldly wisdom, right? His perspective is under the sun. It's an earthly perspective. This is worldly wisdom. And he puts it on this side of the scale. And over on this side of the scale, he puts madness and folly, which are like synonyms for the same type of thing, right? You're weighing out. If there's something meaningful in life, maybe it's found in wisdom, or maybe it's found in madness and folly. Well, to no one's surprise, wisdom's going to be better, right? That's what happens. He says, what more can a king's successor do than what he's already done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. So that's his experiment. Wisdom on this side, madness and folly on this side. And which one is heavier? Wisdom. See, wisdom is far better because, well, we want wisdom in life, do we not? Like, don't we go after wisdom? It gives us more opportunity, especially when we're talking about worldly wisdom. And education is a great thing. You get further in life, right? You have more opportunities if you can go after those types of things. It's weightier, right? The comparison is a comparison of light and darkness. And he's saying, basically, it's better to be wise in life than it is to be a fool. Because if you're wise, you're kind of like walking around in the light. You can see all the obstacles that's in front of you. You're not going to run into anything. But if you're a fool, it's kind of like stumbling around in the darkness, right? You're reaching out your hands, hoping that you don't run face first into the wall or the TV or stumble over the couch, right? Or step on the dog. That's typically what I do first thing in the morning, right? I'm on my way out to get coffee, and now we have this little tiny dog, and he runs right in front of me, and it's dark, right? Wisdom is better than madness and folly, just as light is better than darkness. You want to be able to see where you're going. And that's an obvious conclusion, but the obvious conclusion is only to show the surprising finding that he finds. In fact, here's what it says. Yet, when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing of the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Actually, I read the wrong verse. Verse 14, the wise have eyes to see in their head while the fools walk in darkness. But I realize that the same fate overtakes them both. So although you have this scale that wisdom is definitely better than madness and folly, they have a common fate. And can you think of maybe what that common fate may be? Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? I said to myself, this too is meaningless. This is going to bring me to my first point. There's a problem of death, right? No matter how wise or how foolish you are, it's appointed that every man should die once and then face judgment, right? And so you can pursue worldly wisdom. It might get you further ahead in life. It's weightier than foolishness than foolishness, but in the end, They both share that common fate. And death is going to make a fool out of both the wise and the foolish. Right? That's the common fate that he's talking about. It's meaningless because everybody dies. Look at verse 16. For the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. Like that's the meaningless nature of life lived under the sun. With simply an earthly perspective, both the wise man and the foolish person is going to have to perish. And any wisdom that can't figure out the problem of death is not very wise, right? So in Carson City, they have this cemetery. In fact, I think the greatest testament to this point that the teacher is making is all the cemeteries that live in every town, right? I mean, every town has them. The town I grew up in, it's just basically, I grew up in Winnemucca, by the way, and it's just basically Main Street is just a cemetery. And you make it a little bit past the cemetery, and there might be a restaurant or two before you run out of town. Like it's a testament that it's appointed to every man to die once and then face judgment. Carson City has more than one cemetery, right? It has quite a few. In fact, there's some cemeteries that people don't know anything about, and I'll show you a picture of one. This cemetery is over on Sea Hill, right? So if you're on the west end of town by the American flag, this cemetery is at the very base of that, at the edge of Fifth Street, and you can see what it looks like now. Right? This cemetery is a sad reality to the truth that death makes a fool out of both the wise and the foolish. Because as you walk through this cemetery, there's no fence to keep it safe. Most of the headstones have now fallen over. You can see from the picture, they're just laying there on the ground, just like name tags or markers for the people that lay underneath. Now, there are some graves that are still standing. Right? And it's kind of odd because the houses are backed up against it. So some people just walk out their backyard right into a graveyard that's not even marked. There are some graves that have lasted the test of time. One name that pops out to me is Ormsby, because this is where Ormsby was buried. And you know the name because, well, we have streets named after the man, and lots of businesses in town are named after the man. But did you know his grave was over there? No, his grave is still standing because he had the means to put something more lasting, but it's tilting. And I would wonder if in 50 years, if it's not just going to be laying on the ground with the rest of them. Now, in the world's eyes, he may have been wise. I mean, obviously, he had the means to put up this marble headstone that's lasted since the 1800s, which in the grand scheme of things, is that very long either? And it's sitting there as a testament to who he was. And people are like, well, this was a wise guy. But there are other people that are buried, and now sagebrush has kind of grown up over their graves. But it doesn't matter what it looks like on the top. You can tell there's some inequality on the top, right? Because he has a better grave that's lasted longer, a better headstone that's lasted longer. And this person, it's fallen over and sagebrush has grown up over it. But underneath the ground, they're the same. It doesn't matter. Now, we'll talk about legacy in a second, but the problem of meaninglessness in the book of Ecclesiastes is that life is fleeting. And he's going to try out wisdom, and he's going to try out madness and folly. And wisdom is definitely better than madness and folly, but in the end, it doesn't matter anyway, because in the end, you're going to end up in the ground. Because the problem of meaningless is a problem with death. We all die. And if you're looking for meaning under the sun, our common fate is the reason why it's hard to find. It's the problem that makes the question crooked. Right? What is crooked cannot be straightened. That's the problem that makes the question crooked, is death. And we all know how death came into the world, right? It is an effect of sin. In fact, I wanted to read it. It's in Genesis chapter 3. I want to show you how this crooked question became crooked. In Genesis chapter 3, it says, "Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, 'Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?' The woman said to the serpent, we may eat fruit from the trees in the garden, but God did say, you must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it or you will die. That's the law, right? And that's what sin is. Sin is lawlessness. And Eve knew the law. Now, we don't know how she knew it, because you can go back and read Genesis chapter 2 and you don't find God telling Eve this, but you can't question the fact that she did know it because she repeats it. It's ingrained. She knows, right? She tells the serpent exactly what God had said. That's the law. But then sin seizes the opportunity afforded by the law, and it says this, you will not certainly die, the serpent said to the woman, for God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. See, that's the lie. She knows the law, and the serpent comes in with the lie. It seizes the opportunity afforded it to it by the law and lies. And then verse 6, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave it to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. See, the greatest, I guess, sin, if you want to define sin, it's lawlessness. They knew the law. Satan used the opportunity afforded to it by the law, and then they gave in to sin. They broke the law, right? But the deception was this. The deception was God is not looking out for what's best for you. No, he's lying to you. And when Satan was able to convince Adam and Eve that it was God who was lying, well, that's when death entered into the world and made the question crooked. There's a problem, right? The reason what life so often feels meaningless when you're looking for it only under the perspective of under the sun is that death is a common fate that's going to take everyone. There's also a problem with legacy, and that's my second point. There's a problem with legacy. And in verse 17 he says this, so I hated life because the works that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Pay attention, he doesn't say he hates his life, right? We're not thinking that the teacher is suicidal here. What he's saying is I hated life, like the whole fleeting nature, the fact that death is going to take care of everyone. It's going to be the great equalizer. I hated it, right? Because it seems so meaningless, like a breath chasing after a breath, or like it's meaningless, like chasing after the wind. You can't catch it, right? So it's a problem for him. So verse 18 says this, I hated all the things that I toiled for under the sun because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. See, that's the problem with legacy. He knows for sure that he's going to die, but after he dies, what's going to happen to everything that he had brought? I told you last week the parable of the rich man, the rich fool who stored and stored and stored. At the end of his life, God said, well, who's getting your stuff now? You fool. Right? That's the problem here. He knows he's going to work, and after he works, no matter how hard he works, he's going to die, and then who knows what's going to happen to all the stuff that comes after him. In verse 19 it says, and who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish, yet they will have control over the fruit of my toil into which I poured all my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. You see his problem? Assets. I've worked so hard to get my house and to save up my savings and to make sure that I have everything that I need. I've worked so hard to store in barns. But I know I'm going to die, and when I die, who knows who's going to get my stuff? He could be a wise person or he could be a foolish person, but I don't know which one. I have no control over that. See, that's part of the fleeting nature of life, is that you have no control over the things that you have, like those possessions. After you die, they're gone. Some people with a heavenly perspective seem to be okay with that. But if your perspective is simply under the sun, well, that's everything you worked your life to accomplish. We were actually talking about this in Tuesday night Rifleman Bible study, and we quoted Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 11, where it talks about no one will be remembered after they're gone, right? Like the generations come, generations go. No one's going to be remembered after. And when I preached on that, I said it was like walking on the beach, and the water comes and washes your footprints away, right? That's what life is like. Like your legacy is not yours to control. And we started talking about not the material legacy, although that is a major part of what people worry about. But then there's also the immaterial legacy as well, right? Like how is my name going to be remembered? And how is like what I accomplished going to be remembered? And people set out all kinds of ways to make sure that their name continues after their death, right? They write books, they take pictures. They want their name to be remembered. Well, on Tuesday night, we were talking about this in Ken's favorite metaphors with sports or music. And this time we were talking about sports, right? And what we were saying is well, the conversation typically goes the same every time I talk to Ken about sports. He loves baseball, and I like football. Now, I can't talk baseball because I don't watch baseball, but Ken still can talk football because that's the kind of mind he has. He just can tell you like all the different details and statistics and all this stuff. But for his love for football, kind of like it runs out in time. Like usually the conversation goes like, oh yeah, football, it's not the same as it was, right? And then he'll look back at people like, I had this written down today. He'll look back at people like Dick Butkus, which what a great name, Dick Butkus, right? I watched a couple videos on him this week, right? He was a football player in the 60s and 70s for the Chicago Bears. And he's said to be the most feared man in football, right? Now, the videos I watched, I understand why he would be the most feared man in football, because the way he tackled isn't even legal in today's sport, right? Like he's going for the head and trying to twist. Like I don't know whether he wanted to break their neck or what, right? But he was somebody that is a legend in his time, the most feared man in football. And he's still alive, by the way. But if you go talk to the average football fan, what do you think about Dick Butkus? They say, who? Like, who? And I thought, that's a sad thing, right? Like this guy is still alive, and yet his legacy is already being erased to time. And that's the fate of man. Some people will have a more lasting legacy, but ultimately it's going to be washed away in the tide as well. It's going away. See, that's the problem. That's why life is fleeting, because everybody must die, and you have no control of your legacy once you die. Will you be remembered? And to make this point absolutely clear, the writer of Ecclesiastes, or the teacher in verse 22, repeats the same question. What do people get from all their toil and anxious striving for which they labor under the sun? It's his way of saying, this is the question that we're trying to answer. Consider it. Like this question, by the time we're done with this book, should be like beat into your heads. Is there any profit for the anxious thoughts that you toil with under the sun? By the way, they don't just stop under the sun. Listen to this verse 23. All their days, their work is grief and pain. Even their nights, their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless. Isn't that amazing? Like you're done working, but your mind is not. And so even though your body is stopped, time is still passing. And you're laying in bed anxious, right? Like my wife, I promised one time I would tell her before I talked about her in my sermon, and I forgot to do that today. So this whole week she's been preparing for a carnival at her school. And when I say this whole week, what I really mean this whole year, right? Because it's been like on her mind every time I talk to her. It's like, what are you doing? Carnival. Like it's been that kind of week. She's just so like focused on this thing that it haunts her through the night, right? And sometimes I wake up at 1 o'clock in the morning and I look over and she's on her phone looking at stuff to take her mind off the carnival. Thank God it's behind us. It faded. It passed like on the waves, right? And so like it's gone, thank God. But isn't that what life is like? Like you spend all your time working on something, you worry about it at night, and then the event comes and it goes. And people say, that was a great event. They forget about it till next year. right? But that's your life. It's fleeting. It's a breath. You breathe in, you breathe out, you chase after the breath of God, hoping for something eternal, hoping for something lasting. And as long as your perspective is at ground level, you're not going to find it. It's going to take me to my last point. My last point is that satisfaction is in the hands of God. And I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to present two ways of understanding this verse because the last 2 weeks I've been wrestling with this section of Scripture because there is differences in how it's interpreted. So let me read it, and then I'll explain. In verse 24, it says this: "A person could do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their toil. This too I see is from the hand of God. For without Him, who can eat or find enjoyment? The person who pleases Him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But the sinner He gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing of the wind." So do you guys notice how it's a positive passage? And maybe it's a breath of air because we've gone through just 2 chapters of Ecclesiastes. And this is the first positive thing that we've seen in the most pessimistic book, right? We find that there is something that can bring us satisfaction. These verses are called carpe diem verses in the book of Ecclesiastes. And I didn't think anybody would know what that even means, so I wasn't going to bring it up. And then I asked Craig this morning, and he said it means seize the day. It's Latin for seize or pluck the day. And the point of it is there's these small sections scattered throughout Ecclesiastes that give us a glimpse of something that is above the sun. It introduces God into the text in the way that the writer doesn't typically introduce God. And it shows us that maybe there might be something that brings satisfaction to us, right? And there are 2 ways of interpreting these verses. The first way is to do it just like I just told you. These verses are glimpses of a heavenly perspective, right? These verses are glimpses of a heavenly perspective. And so they show us how we might find satisfaction and profit and peace in a life lived here on earth, right? And when you read it with that perspective, it makes good sense. I mean, look at what it says in verse 24. The person could do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction with their toil, right? So that's contradictory to what he just said 1 verse earlier, where he said, you labor under the sun, right? It's evil, it's toil to labor under the sun. Now he says there's nothing better than to toil under the sun. This is where you find satisfaction. But notice that it gives you a different perspective. This too is from the hand of God. So it's telling us that maybe we can find satisfaction if we realize the things that we have are gifts from God. They come from the hands of God. And that eat and drink, I mean, first of all, it's a great metaphor. I can relate to it because what better thing can you do to find meaning in life than to eat? I mean, I could think of one better, but it's not appropriate. There's things that are meaningful in life that give us meaning and value in that moment, right? Food is the greatest one. Right? I love going out to eat and sitting with people, and there's satisfaction in that. But he says this is from the hands of God, right? It's the Bible uses that as to talk about moments of peace. In fact, if you read the prophets, one of the things they're hoping for is this day in which everyone will have their own fig tree and be able to sit underneath it and eat from its fruit. It's time of peace and satisfaction. Right? The best way to find satisfaction in this life is to recognize that even your toil is a gift from God, something that comes from the hand of God. In fact, he says it like this in a rhetorical question. He says, "For without Him, who can eat or find enjoyment?" Maybe you might want to think of what Paul says in the book of Acts. And I have a little bit of time to read it, so I will. In Acts chapter 17, verse 24, he says, "The God who made this world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. And He is not even served by human hands as if He needed anything. Rather, He Himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else." So we get this glimpse of a heavenly perspective that says everything that I have, the toil itself, is something that's given to me by the hand of God, and that's how I find satisfaction in it. That's how I find something of meaning in a world that feels meaningless. But there's more. He goes on to not just ask a rhetorical question, but he goes on to give two different scenarios. The one who pleases God and the one who displeases God in verse 26. To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. Right? That's, again, not worldly wisdom now because the change in perspective. We're looking at things from the hands of God. Wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives a task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. So in this life, you're working, and if you're pleasing God, well, God's going to bless you for that. And if you're living a life that doesn't please God, he's going to take so that he can give to someone who does please God. And this is God's economy, God's justice system, right? And I think it's best described in the book of Proverbs. I'm going to read this too because I think it kind of points out where he's saying in Proverbs 28, verse 8, it says, whoever increases wealth by taking interest or profit from the poor amasses it for another who will be kind to the poor. So it's not like God is just, like taking from this man because he's displeased with this man to give it to this person so that he can build bigger barns. That's not what's going on in God's economy system. Now, in God's economy system, he blesses those who show wisdom, who try to please him. He blesses them with wisdom, knowledge, and happiness so that they can give and be more generous and give to others. But to those sinners, well, he takes it away and gives it to people who's going to be generous. So the first way of understanding these passages, these seize the day passages, is to see them as a glimpse from a different perspective. To say, well, all things, the satisfaction that we have in life, can only come by understanding they come from the hand of God. It comes from the hand of God. The other way is interesting too, and that's why I'm telling you both, because usually I just tell you what I think and then make you guys just believe that's the only idea out there. But this time I'm going to tell you there's two ideas. And this view says, yes, this is a bright spot in a book of meaninglessness, a bright spot in pessimistic book. But it's still just as meaningless because it's still only considering a earthly perspective. And so they'll be quick to point out that the writer of Ecclesiastes doesn't say this is good, but the best possible option. See, so they'll say, notice it says, a person could do nothing better. He's not saying this is good, but this is the best possible option if you're living in this perspective, is to accept your lot in life and to find contentment in it. Understand that God gives some and he takes away from others. And the best you can do with this is to accept your lot and find contentment. And maybe there's something true in that as well, right? Because see, I think there's something better than just accepting, eating, and drinking and finding satisfaction in your toil. I think it comes from a New Testament perspective. Somebody like Paul who gave up his life in order to live with a resurrection perspective. See, he could have taken the teacher's advice here and just built tents. And just, that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to build tents and then I'm going to go on vacation when I retire. That's the best I got. That's the best possible option. But Paul doesn't do that. Paul gives up his life in order to find true satisfaction. He lives with an eternal perspective, not simply a perspective under the sun. And so in 1 Corinthians, we see this. He talks about, well, if life was it, if there is no resurrection, then what did I go through all this for? Why didn't I just eat, drink, and be merry? So look at 1 Corinthians in verse, I think I said verse 31. He says, I face death every day. Yes, just as surely as I boast about you in Christ Jesus our Lord. If I fought with wild beasts in Ephesus with no more than human hopes, then what have I gained? You see his question? If I lived this life and gave myself up without any hope in a resurrection, then what was the point of it? But see, he does believe in a resurrection, so he finds value in laying his life down. And he says this, if the dead are not raised, let us eat, drink, for tomorrow we die. See, doesn't that sound like what the writer of Ecclesiastes says? You know, like, what better can you do than just eat and drink and find satisfaction in your toil, for this is from the hands of God? Well, if your view is only under the sun, well, that's the best you can come up with, is to accept that this is how you find contentment. Accept the gifts from God and be content in them. And there's value in that way of seeing the passage, by the way. I don't want to blow off that way of seeing the passage. But I think the New Testament perspective says, no, the way to find real satisfaction in life is not to just eat and drink and find satisfaction in your toil, but it's to lay your life down. It's to give it up so that you can truly find it. That's how we find contentment under the sun, S-O-N.